So today we're going to be discussing how static vehicle demand is added to the network in the form of vehicle inputs, along with how those vehicles will then be routed through the network. So as a part of this, we'll be covering both adding and editing these static routing decisions and static vehicle routes. So within Vissim, there are a couple of different methods to route vehicles through the network. The two most common ones are static assignment and dynamic assignment. So when you're using static assignment, this will use just a set number of vehicles that will be added to the network. And that set of vehicles will then be assigned to a defined set of fixed paths or routes that we will set up. Whereas on the flip side, we have dynamic assignment, where the demand is going to be assigned in the form of an origin-destination matrix. And when you're using dynamic assignment, this is really an iterative process that will allow vehicles to change their path assignment based on the travel time, based on the levels of congestion in the network. They'll also take into account things like the distance and the financial cost of different routes. So as a part of that iterative process, they'll kind of reevaluate their path choice during each iteration. And today we're really going to be looking at the static assignment part, and then in future sessions we'll take a closer look at using dynamic assignment. All right, so in order to add the demand for static assignment to a network, all of the traffic volumes will be added using the vehicle input network object. And so these volumes are always going to be entered in as a number of vehicles per hour. And I'll show you a little bit later where you can add in different time intervals, but even if that time period is longer or shorter than 1 hour, the amount of volume that you'll enter in will always need to be in vehicles per hour. And when the vehicles are entering the link, they will enter at a stochastic rate based on a Poisson distribution. So this will kind of be that random element as the vehicles are entering the network. And if any of the defined traffic volume ever exceeds that link capacity, so if you're seeing a lot of backups leading up to that network entry point, those vehicles will then be stacked outside of the network until there is available space. And if any of those stacked vehicles are not able to enter the network within that simulation run, this will be considered to be latent demand, and all of that information will then be written to a log file. So you can always view that after the simulation has complete if you do have any latent demand left in the network. All right, so in order to add these into the network, the first thing you'll need to do is go over to that network objects toolbar and just select that vehicle input object. And then from there, you can either add these inputs by right-clicking on the link and then opening that context menu where you can click Add New Vehicle Input, and that will just drop in that input line. Or alternatively, you can just press Control and right-click to add that vehicle input directly to a link. And when you're adding these inputs, these will really just show up as a line on the link itself, and these will always be placed at the very start of the link. All right, so when a new vehicle input is added into the network, it's going to automatically open up this kind of list where you can see all of the different vehicle inputs. And all of the attributes for these vehicle inputs will be located within this list itself. So there's no separate editing window like there are for links and connectors, but all of the attributes will really just be shown here in this list window. And so these attributes include things like the number of the input as well as the name. And then you'll also see the link that that input was placed on. And then again, here's where you can enter in that number of vehicles per hour within that volume attribute. And again, this will always be in vehicles per hour, even if you have multiple time intervals defined. And then finally here on the vehicle input itself, you can add in that vehicle composition. And this vehicle composition is going to reference that vehicle composition under the traffic tab. And so this is where the information about the percentage of vehicle types is contained. So this is where you could set up, if you had maybe an arterial roadway split where you have maybe more private vehicles than heavy trucks, or if you had a freeway roadway split where that contains a higher percentage of heavy trucks, you can create different vehicle compositions for that, and then you can assign that vehicle composition to a specific vehicle input. And you'll also see here that both of these have a 0 next to them in parentheses, and this number will always just represent the start of the time interval that's been defined. And in this case, we just have a single time interval, so you'll just see that one 0 shown here. Okay, and then on the child window over here on the right-hand side, this is where more detailed data for each time interval can be found. And again, here we just have a single time interval set, so there's just going to be this one single line item. The first option within in the child window here is this option called continued. And essentially, if we did have multiple time intervals defined, there'd be separate line items. And if you have this checked, this will allow that particular time interval to use the same volume as the previous time interval. So if we did have a second item here and that continued option was checked, that one would also have a volume of 500 vehicles per hour. And then also here on the right-hand side, you can update the vehicle type. So you can either adjust this to be stochastic, which will vary the number of vehicles that are placed onto the network, or you can change this to exact, which will place exactly that many vehicles onto the network. So again, when you're running a simulation, you may want to define multiple time intervals in order to vary the traffic, either if you wanted to add maybe a warm-up time period, or maybe you have demand data that's every 15 or 30 minutes or in hourly increments. So you can add additional time intervals to enter in volume for each of those intervals. So while you're in the vehicle input window, if you right-click on the left-hand side, you can then select that option that says Edit Time Interval. And this will open up a new tab down at the bottom. So this will be that time interval list. And there are a lot of different time intervals for many of the network objects within Vissim. But if you open it through that vehicle input list, this will automatically open a list for vehicle inputs. And you'll see that here in the drop-down menu where it's going to show vehicle inputs here. So that's just another way you can check and make sure that you are defining time intervals for the vehicle inputs. And then if you click this plus button here, this will allow you to add in additional time intervals. And then here's where you can edit that start time. So if you wanted to change these to be every 30 minutes instead of every 15 minutes, you can just adjust this time. And this will always be shown in simulation seconds. So once those time intervals have been added, then you'll need to go back to that vehicle input list. And by default, it is still just going to show that information for that very first time interval, since we just had that one defined. But in order to add these into the list, you can select this wrench icon here, and this will allow you to select additional attributes and add them into this list view. So when you click the wrench icon, this will open up this window here on the right-hand side. And this contains an entire list of all of the different attributes associated with vehicle inputs. And if you see anything here with a little plus button, this will be any of the time-dependent attributes. So here, if you click on vehicle composition and on volume, you'll see each of those time intervals that we just defined will show up in this list. And then in order to add them to the display of the list itself, you can either double click on these. So if you double click on volume, it'll bring over everything that's contained within volume, and you'll see it over here on the right-hand side. Or you can just double click on these individual line items, or you can also just highlight them and then use this arrow key up here at the top in order to move those over. So whichever option you prefer, and then everything that will be displayed in the list will just show up here on the right-hand side. And this will also show you that full name, and again, each of those interval start times will be shown in parentheses. So once you click OK from there, then you'll see that each of these will be added as a new column. And so each of those will show up in that list. And again, you'll see that the volume and the vehicle compositions listed here with that interval start time. And now that we have some additional time intervals defined, you'll also see these will show up in the child window on the right-hand side. And so each of these will show up as their own separate line item, and each one will have a time interval defined here as well, so you can see each of those in more detail. So by default, once you have those added, you'll see here that everything is kind of set to that continued attribute, so each of those have that checked. And so you'll notice that since that is continued, all of these options will actually be grayed out because these all depend on the previous time interval. So if you updated this volume, this number of vehicles per hour to say 600, all of those would automatically copy that and use that volume. Now, if you do want to edit this and enter in individual values for each of these time intervals, you'll just need to uncheck those, and then that will open up all of these cells so that you can add in the volume for each of those time intervals individually. Okay, and then once you have those time intervals added, you can also update that volume type again. So you can either leave that as stochastic if you want to vary the number of vehicles that will be randomly entering the network, or you can change that to exact if you want that exact amount of volume to enter the network. And if you do change any of these to exact, you'll see that some of these cells pertaining to that particular time interval will then be highlighted in yellow. And that will show up both in this child window on the right and then also in the main window over here on the left. So you'll see all of those, but the volume and vehicle composition will just show as yellow. Just kind of alerting you to the fact that these are set to exact while the others are set to stochastic. Okay, so now we have our demand added into the network using those vehicle inputs, but now we need to tell the vehicles where they need to travel. So when we're using that static assignment method, all of this will be done using static routing decisions and static routes. So the overall routing decision start point that we'll be placing will show up as purple, and so you'll see that main starting point here. And then any of the route endpoints will be shown in light blue. And then all of the link sequence that that particular route travels over will be highlighted in yellow, so you can see exactly what link sequence those vehicles will take when they're traveling through the network. And when you're using these routing decision start points, you will typically have one for a network entry point, and then you will have multiple routes, just depending on where those vehicles are going from that particular origin point. So static routes can be modeled in a couple of different ways. So, and this will really depend on what type of data you have. But if you do want to model them and you have data for like that full origin destination pair, you can add in that origin start point again at that network entry location, and then you can place that endpoint at the destination location. And so this will be a route for that full path for that origin and destination point. However, if you do have data in the form of turn counts, then it might be easier to actually code the routes at a turn-by-turn level. So in this case, you can place your routing decision start point and then your route endpoint right after that turn. And then from there, you can place a new route start point that will take the vehicles through the next turn and then so on. So if you do have your data in at the turn count level, it might be easier to model it using this kind of turn-by-turn method. When you're using this, it's just important to make sure that the new route start point is placed downstream of that route endpoint so that the vehicles can fully leave one route and then pick up that new route. So in order to add these static routes to the network, if you go over to the network object toolbar on the left-hand side, you can highlight that vehicle route object. And when you do select this, there'll be a small arrow here where it has a drop-down menu. And in this menu is where you can choose the static option for vehicle routes. In here, the routes also contain other routes if you were modeling public transit, and some other routes, different route types in there as well. But in this case, when we're doing static assignment, we'll just need to make sure we add the static vehicle routes. And then when you go to add in these routes, you can either right-click on the link and then click Add New Static Vehicle Routing Decision. And so again, that will just add in this purple line here for that start point. And then from there, you can use the left click to place those destination points. And you'll see it'll highlight in light blue at the very end. And you can place these points for as many destination locations as you have. And then you can also do this not through the context menu, but if you just press Control and right click when you're on a link, that will place, again, that starting point for those vehicle routing decisions. And then again, you can just use that same left click to place that destination point. So in order to view all of these static route attributes, you can open up that list. If you right click again on the vehicle routes option here in the network object toolbar, you can then go to show list, and then you can select static, and you'll see all the other different types of routes that exist within this as well. But once you choose that static option, that will open up this window down here at the bottom that contains the list information for all of those static vehicle routing decisions and the static vehicle routes. And this window is made up of two different sections. So the overall starting point for that routing decision, again, that purple start point, is going to be shown here on the left-hand side. So this will be before the main static routing decision. And then on the right-hand side are all of the corresponding static routes, which will be those blue endpoints. So in this example here, we have routing decision number 3 highlighted, and you'll see that this contains 5 different static routes, each with different endpoints at different links. And like vehicle inputs, these static routing decisions and routes all contain their attributes here within this list view, so there is no separate edit window. So all of these attributes are just shown right here in this list. And as far as the routing decisions themselves go, again, you can number those and name them. And then you'll also see that link where those routing decision points are, as well as the position on the link. And for the overall routing decisions, you can also set the vehicle classes that are allowed. So if this is selected, this will allow any vehicle class to pick up this route. Whereas if you uncheck this option, you can then choose different vehicle classes from this drop-down menu. So if you maybe had separate routing decisions for heavy trucks or for private vehicles, you can set those up here by just unchecking that and selecting that corresponding vehicle type. And then right beside that is where you can also change the route choice method. And by default, this will be set to static, which will use this relative flow attribute that we'll talk about next. But there is also another option here where you can select formula. And this will essentially allow you to set up your own user-defined formula where you can, that can be constantly updating. And then vehicles will select a route based on that formula return type. So if you had any sort of maybe a different modeling that you needed to, didn't want to use like a static relative flow value, you can always use this formula option, which just allows for more flexibility when you are assigning vehicles to different routes in the network. Okay, and then all of those static route attributes, again, will be shown on the right-hand side. And these also have a number associated with them, and you can also name these. If you did choose the static option over here in the route choice method, or sorry, the formula method, then you can enter in that formula value over here. And then you can also see again that destination position, so where that destination link is, as well as the position on that link. And then finally, here is that relative flow value that will be used for any of the static route choice options. And so this relative flow is really used to determine the proportion of vehicles that are going to take each of the paths and each of those individual routes that we've set up. And so this proportion is determined by taking the relative flow of one particular path, so say this 0.2 value, and then just dividing it by the sum of all of these paths together. And because of this will allow you some flexibility when you're entering in these relative flow values. So you can either enter these in as a percentage, or if you maybe have, again, like turn count data, you can enter this in as number of vehicles as well. So really whichever method works best for you, kind of based on the data that you're using in your network. And then similar to vehicle inputs, you can also add in different time intervals for routing decisions. And this will allow you to change those relative flow values over time. So if you, again, just right-click over here in the routing decisions window, you can then choose to edit time intervals. And then here is where you can see that time interval tab that will open up. And you'll see up here at the top, instead of saying vehicle inputs, this will show up as vehicle routes or static. So this will just, again, give you another indicator that you are adding time intervals for the static route. And then if you click, again, that green plus button, this is where you can add in those different time intervals and then edit these as desired, just based on how frequently you want to update that relative flow value. All right, so then once you have those time intervals added, again, in order to add these to the list, if you select the wrench icon that's on the static vehicle route window over here on the right, you can then select these different relative flow values. And just like the vehicle inputs, these will also show that interval start time here in parentheses. So you can see we've got starting at 0 and then 900, 1800 seconds. And then you can update these static relative flow values based on those time intervals. Okay, so we have our route start and end points placed in the network. And when you are placing these for the first time, Vissim will automatically select that shortest path when it is determining that link sequence. And again, that link sequence will just be shown in yellow here. And then once this route has been placed, you can then further edit that route and change that position. So if you wanted to kind of move where that particular path goes, you can edit that once that route has been placed. So in order to edit that route, first you'll just need to left click on that route endpoint. You can also select that route within that route list as well. And once that route has been selected, you can then create different intermediate points. And these will show up as yellow dots here. So if you press Control and then right click, you can place some of these along the route. And these can be used to either lock down the route, or it can be used as points that you can then click and drag. So for example, if you had maybe a much larger network where you didn't want to adjust like the first portion of the route or the end portion, and you just wanted to edit the middle, you can place these points here. So if I place one here, then this kind of point upstream of that would be locked down. Similarly, if I placed another one here near the end, any points downstream of that would kind of be locked down. And then from there, you can place a point in the middle, anywhere near where you need to change that particular route. And then once you have that intermediate point selected, you'll just left click on that. And then you can click and drag that to another link. And that will essentially reroute the vehicles and change that path to use that new link that you've selected. And so you'll see once you have that kind of point drag to the new link, you'll see that link sequence will be automatically updated. And then when you're ready to complete your route and you've made all of your edits, you can then just click on an empty area within the network editor window, and that will just confirm the route, and it'll just show it as highlighted at the end here without those intermediate points. And then sometimes when you have placed routes in the network, you may need to go back and then make some additional geometry edits, which sometimes includes splitting or deleting links and connectors. And when you are doing this, this can then sometimes lead to broken routes in the network. And if a route was broken, say we removed or deleted a link, a connector that was in here, you'll see that this will just show up as kind of a blank space. So you'll see the beginning part where the link is still in, or that link sequence is still intact, and then the end portion. But you'll kind of see this broken area here in the middle. And you can, if this is just a few routes, you can either manually edit them, kind of using that process we just discussed, where you can click and add those intermediate points and then drag those. But sometimes this can be a much larger amount of routes and you don't really want to edit those manually. So in that case, if you want to have Vissim kind of just check all of the routes and just see if there are any broken ones, you can, as long as you have that route option selected in the Network Objects toolbar, you can just right-click in the network editor itself to open up that context menu. And then in here, you can choose that option to check and fix all routes. And what this will do is Vissim will just search for all of those broken routes, and it will try to repair them for you. And you'll see here, it will then open up this prompt when it's doing this route completion. And it will redo that link sequence for you, so you can kind of see how it's creating or fixing that route. And if you are satisfied with this, you can just select yes, or you can choose no if this would be something you'd want to manually update after. And it is important to note that if you did move a link that maybe this route previously was on, so if you maybe just completely took this link, moved it away, and replaced it with a new link number, sometimes this route completion process will still try to have that route go over that moved link. So it's always a good idea just to look through each of these broken routes when it's going through this procedure, just to make sure that that path selection has been updated appropriately. And you don't have any kind of wonky routes that end up coming up where you have traveling along here and then suddenly it jumps over to like this link section and then jumps back to kind of try to finish its route. But using this prompt here, this will allow you to kind of see each of the routes individually. And if you click yes, it will move on to the next route. And this will just give you a quick glance at how that overall route choice repair went. All right, so another automatic feature in Vissim that can be helpful, especially if you're modeling those routes using that turn-by-turn method, this option is called Combine Routes. And essentially what this will do is it will connect static routes together that are in separate routing decisions. So for example, here we have kind of a turn-by-turn routing decisions built up. And this will basically take all of these routes that are defined here and then combine them with the upstream routes. And this can be especially useful, again, when you're modeling things as this turn-by-turn routing decisions, because when the routes are kind of separate like this, where you have vehicles traveling along this route, and then they'll drop off that route and pick up a new one, is that when the vehicles are choosing that new route, they may realize quite late that they need to make a lane change. For example, a vehicle could be here in this left lane, drop off this route, pick up the new route here at the purple line, and then realize it needs to immediately make a right-hand turn here. When in reality, that vehicle maybe already knew far in advance that it was going to need to make this right turn. So sometimes when you're modeling things with this turn-by-turn setup, the vehicles may realize the lane change too late, which can then lead to some unrealistic lane change behavior and sometimes create these artificial queues in the network. So using this combined route feature can help prevent this, because vehicles will then know their route much sooner, basically from that very beginning point. So they'll know their path ahead of time and can make those lane changes more appropriately. And so this will only work for routing decisions that are on the same link as these other route endpoints. And then for both of these do need to share that same vehicle class setup. So they do need to be allowed for the same vehicle classes. So in order to actually combine these routes, if you right-click on the routing decision start point here, you can then choose that combine routes option. And what this will do is then combine all of those downstream routes with those upstream routes. And you'll see here that the all of these like new links will be also highlighted in yellow, and you'll see those final destination endpoints here in light blue. And since these routes were combined, both of those, the routing decision that was here in the middle that we selected, as well as those other route endpoints, will then be removed from the network, because at this point everything's been combined, and we'll just be left with this overall main routing decision and then each of those destination endpoints. Okay, so we have our vehicles in the network, and then we have our routes placed for the vehicles to use. So in order for these to work together, essentially a vehicle will be placed onto the network, again using those vehicle input points. And as it's traveling along, it will initially have no route. And then as soon as the front of that vehicle hits this routing decision start point, it will then select a route. So then starting on from this point forward, it will have a route until it passes by that blue destination endpoint. And if you do want to check any of the vehicle's routing information, while the simulation is running, you can just left click on a vehicle, and by default this will just be highlighted in pink. And then you can either use that quick view window, which will show up in the lower left-hand corner, or you can right click on the vehicles in the network object, and you can open up that list. So again, using either that quick view window or the vehicle list, you can see more information about the vehicle itself, including information about the route that it is currently on. And so these are just a few of the routing decision attributes, especially for the static routes that you can add. So again, if you click that little wrench icon, either here or in the list, this is where you can add in the routing decision type. So in this case, since we're using static routes, this will just show as static. You can also add in this vehicle route static attribute, which will show you the routing decision number. So that like main route number, and shown in purple here, will be the 1. And then it will be a dash with that static route number. So in this case, this vehicle's on routing decision number 1, picking up a route number 4. And you can also add in these individual routing decision number and route number attributes as well, which will again just show 1 and 4 for those. And so this is really useful when you're debugging a network, if you're trying to track down a vehicle to see where it's going, or even just to check vehicles and make sure they have a route assigned to them. So this is just a really useful tool to be able to see more information about the vehicles themselves. Okay, so we have just a few tips here for both coding and reviewing models. So when you're looking at a model, it's always a good practice to make sure that all of the vehicles in the network have a route assigned to them that either takes them to another route or it takes them to the end of a link at the network exit point to kind of take that vehicle through the network, and so it can leave the network at the proper place. And if a vehicle does not have a route, what can happen is that that vehicle really doesn't have a path in the network. So what can happen is that that may cause the vehicle to take unrealistic paths, which can cause some unnecessary congestion. And it may also have the vehicles actually disappear from the network. So here's an example where this truck here does not have a route assigned to it. And because it doesn't have a route, it doesn't have any information to tell it to use this left lane to continue on this road. So what happens in this case is that the truck still just keeps staying in its own lane, and you'll see it doesn't even try to get over in this case. It'll just keep driving, and then eventually it'll just disappear from the network. And that vehicle will just be gone and will not regenerate. So it is just very important to make sure that a vehicle, again, has those routes throughout their entire journey, just to prevent this kind of behavior from occurring. And then also, if you are doing, especially like that turn-by-turn method for route placement, If a vehicle is already on a route, it's not going to be able to pick up a new route until it's passed by this destination point. So in order for a vehicle traveling on this route to switch from this route and pick up a new route, this routing decision start point will need to be placed downstream of this route endpoint. So this is just important to note, again, if you're using that turn-by-turn movement, because what can happen is if this purple routing decision starts upstream of that route endpoint, the vehicle will not even see this new route start point. So the vehicle essentially end up leaving the route at the blue point, and then it will just continue on its way without a route. So it's just important to make sure if you're looking at a model that has vehicles dropping off of one route to pick up another route, that they are placed appropriately. And then finally, when a vehicle does have a route, it's going to look downstream to its connector, to the next connector it's going to travel on. And it's going to try to choose a lane based on that lane change distance that's set on this particular connector. So if you are running a model and perhaps you notice vehicles are making some late lane changes, you can always increase this distance on the connector itself. And this will allow vehicles to see this connector further in advance and make those lane changes sooner, as long as they do have an available gap and are able to get over into the appropriate lane. So this is just another thing to keep note of when you're running a model. If you notice vehicles are making a lot of late lane changes and the lane change behavior seems a bit unrealistic, you can always update the lane change distance on the connector itself, so the vehicles will see that further in advance and can make their lane changes sooner. Okay, so with that, we can go ahead and take a look at our example file. So here we have our little Tallahassee network that we've been kind of building up over the last few weeks. And so now, in addition to the links and connectors that we've placed in the network, we also have, again, our desired speeds, decisions, and reduced speed areas. And then now we've also added in some of those vehicle inputs and vehicle routes. So all of the vehicle inputs, again, these will just show up as a black line at the very start of a link. So you'll just see these here. Again, these will always be placed at the beginning of the link. So if I right-click on the vehicle input network object, I can then go to Show List, and that will bring up all of the different vehicle inputs in the network. And if I just cycle through these, you'll see that'll kind of highlight the link that input is on. So you can see here we just have these inputs placed at all of the network entry points. And again, here we have that volume defined in vehicles per hour. And in this case, we just have a single time interval defined. So you'll just see that one option here on the right-hand side. Okay, so in order to add these into the network, again, you'll just select that link. And you can either right-click and select Add New Vehicle Input, and that will just drop a new one in here. And then it will also add it to that list automatically. You can also, if you hold Control and right-click, you can also drop in those vehicle input points using those keys. And then once you have that input added, you can add in some volume for that particular input. And again, if you want to define some additional time intervals, while we're in this vehicle input window, you can just right-click and go to Edit Time Intervals. And then you can add in additional intervals here as well. And once these have been added, I'll just go back to this vehicle input window. And you'll see here's where the columns themselves won't update, but if you do select any of these, you'll see each of these new time intervals are now showing up here on the right-hand side. So if you do want to add in additional columns here within this list to make some other updates in this window, you can always select that wrench icon here, and then here's where you can choose those attributes to add. So if I just click on any of these, you can see each of those time intervals that have been defined. And you can either highlight these and then you can just use that arrow key to kind of move over all of those attributes altogether. And if you ever want to remove some of these, you can always just highlight them in this list, and then you can use the other arrow to kind of remove those from that view. And then once you hit OK, each of these will show up here in this window. Again, they're going to pull that continued attribute at first. So if you uncheck that, you'll see that these windows will then, the cells will be opened up, and then you can further edit these if you wanted to enter in different values for each of these time intervals, rather than having the same value for each one. Again, this can be really useful if you're modeling, if you have any different turn counts in maybe in 15-minute increments. Okay, and so then once you have those vehicle inputs added, I'll go over to the vehicle routes now. So again, if I select the vehicle routes option here, you'll see that there is this little arrow. Again, we're allowing you to pick different route types. Since we're just looking at the static assignment, you'll just want to make sure you have the static option selected, which will show up here in parentheses. And again, if you right-click on that object, you can then open up that list for the static route. And here is where you can see all of those, again, the static routing decisions, those main purple points here on the left-hand side, and then the route endpoints here on the right-hand side. And so if I select some of these, you can see, like this one, for example, we've got our main route point placed up here, and then we've got different routes going to each of the different destinations in the network. So again, if we want to add these into the network, you can just select that particular link, and then you can right-click and go to Add New Static Vehicle Routing Decision. And then that will just place that purple point automatically. And you'll see as you're dragging your mouse along different links, you'll see that blue endpoint will show up, as well as the link sequence will be highlighted in yellow. So here's where you can just again, left-click on those destination endpoints that you want your vehicles to go to. And once you have your first routing decision point placed, you can just keep clicking, and you'll keep creating those different static route options. And you'll also see that if at any point in your network you kind of have a location that maybe is not connected properly, like in this case, there is no way for the vehicle entering the network on this link to actually get to this divided highway in the westbound direction. So if I actually place this here, again, you'll kind of see that broken route structure where there is just a gap created. So this is kind of a broken route. And you'll see, I'll just leave this in here for now. But you'll see when you go to run the simulation that a message will show up just letting you know you have a broken route in the network. And so you can either fix this by either removing it if it's not an appropriate route, or you can then go in and add in the links in the network that will allow this connection in order for the vehicles to get from one path to another. And then when you're done kind of adding your routes, you can just click in the empty space, and then that will kind of finish that route creation process. Now, if you ever need to come back in and add a new route to an existing routing decision, you can click on that routing decision, or you can highlight it here in the window. And then again, you can just use Control right-click to place a new static route point in the network. So that will kind of get you back into this route addition mode where you can add in other routes. I'll just remove a few of those. And you'll see when you're adding these in that by default, all of the relative flows will just show up as 1. So this will essentially just allow an even split between each of the routes. And of course, once you have your routes kind of created, you can then come in here and either update this if you wanted to add in values based on in a percentage form, or based on like if you had hourly volumes, you can either enter them in either way. Okay, so then once you have your route created, let me find this one here. So again, if you need to move your route, you can add in those intermediate points, again, by just pressing Control and right-click on the link. In this case, it's a very small network, so if you just add in a single point, it's just going to recalculate to this one option, because there's very few choices here in the network. But again, if you did have maybe a larger network where you wanted to kind of lock down those other points, you can place in additional intermediate points, and then you'll see as you move the middle intermediate point, those other areas will kind of be locked down, and you'll see that those are actually highlighted now in different color, and that will just kind of show you that route is kind of locked to that point. And so you'll see even here, if I lock down this other point, this blue point here in the network, that's going to have that link sequence include that link no matter what. So even if I try to move it up here, it's still going to try to go over that particular sequence. And of course, you can always just move these. You can drag them to another intermediate point if you want to get rid of them. So it's kind of like when you're adding in those spline points into any links or connectors. Okay, so then from here, again, if you wanted to check for any broken routes in the network, I think we've got one here. So you can just right-click in here and then click Check and Fix All Routes. And this will also show you if a route cannot be completed at all. So in this case, there is no available path for this particular route. So again, this is just a location where you could either add in the links to connect this, or you can just delete this route. But if there was an available path, let me find another one here. So say, for example, if this one ended up getting broken, I'll just right-click again and check and fix the route. And so if there is an available path for them to take, then this prompt will show up where you can choose to accept that kind of route repair, or you can choose to decline it and then manually go and edit it. Okay, so once you have all of those added, I think now we can try to play the simulation. So I'll just press that continuous button up here at the top. And now we actually have some vehicles moving on the network. So right now we don't have any sort of control placed in the network yet. We don't have any stop signs or signals. So you'll notice sometimes the vehicles will kind of overlap and drive over each other just because they can't see each other when they're on different links. But now we at least have some vehicles moving through the network. And again, in here, if I press the pause button or the single step, this is where you can kind of see in more detail the vehicles moving through the network. And if you click on one of these, this will allow you to see more information, again, in that quick view window down here in the lower left. And so this is a good option. This is what we'll typically use when we're debugging a network or just need to see more information about these objects without opening up the full list. But here's where you can use that wrench icon again to find more information about the vehicles. You can see vehicles have a lot of built-in attributes associated with them. Up at the top is a search functionality, so you can just kind of type in route, and that will bring up a lot of the different route options. So probably the big ones here, again, are the routing decision number and then the route number itself. So this will just allow you to see that this vehicle is on routing decision number 8 and then route number 3. So again, if I open up that static list, you can see in here, if I click routing decision number 8 and then go to route number 3, which is listed here, here's that particular route that vehicle is on. So you'll see here that vehicle has already made its kind of lane change decision because it knows it needs to take that middle lane, and then it will just continue on its path. So again, being able to view that vehicle information is really useful when you're watching a model and just kind of debugging it and just need to see kind of where those vehicles are going. And then finally, one other item that can be useful when you're trying to see maybe what routes go over a particular link. If I stop the simulation, you can use this link list as well up here. If I just right click and show list, you can use this link list to see more information about what kind of uses those links. So in here, if you change that relation window up here at the top to static vehicle routes, and then if I select this particular link, this will show you all of the different routes that use that link sequence. So this can be really useful, especially for different turning movements, if you want to see all the different routes that use that particular movement. And again, you can also see all the information, that kind of same information about that route itself. So you can see those relative flow values, and again, any of those names or numbers that you've got set up. Okay, so with that kind of brings us to the end of our session regarding vehicle inputs and static routes.